Thank you very much. Actually, I will not say a few words now. We have a very tight agenda because they've given us an hour and a half, but I'm warning them that we don't intend to end at 4 o'clock. So we will have to go over because we cannot cover this, what is the session has to cover in this short space. We have 6 presentations, 6 speakers. 2 of them deal with the overview of how we should be looking at commons. 2 deal, one with the gender dimension, 2 with the Forest Rights Act, and we have also somebody who will talk to us about the Supreme Court judgment. I have to request the people who will be doing the presentation to be brief. I would request that they try and keep to 10 minutes if they can, but certainly not go much beyond that, so maybe to 10 to 15 minutes, but 10 if possible, hoping that that would leave a little time for interaction with the audience. I'm sure many of you also have much to contribute on this issue of common lands and its governance. So I'll try, and if there is time, then I will say a few words at the very end. So let me begin first with the first speaker, Purnendu Kavoori of Azim. I'm going to make the introductions briefer than the very generous introduction I was given. So may I just say the first speaker is Purnendu Kavoori of Azim Premji University, and you have the title of his talk. And I hope some of you have seen the abstract also. But Purnendu, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Distinguished Chairman, Sir, Mr. Desai, fellow panelists, learned members of the audience. I'm grateful to the FES and the organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak in this conference. I can just begin by telling you a little bit about who I am. This is a workshop or a conference on land. I am not a land person. I'm basically a livestock person. Sheep, goat, camel, bhed, bakri, that is my bread and butter. When I see land, I look at pasture, I look at grasses. Even when I see a field, I don't look at the crops, I think of the fodder value of that. So that is my initial bias that I must introduce you to about. But today in the presentation, what I'm going to do, as the Chairman has already pointed out, I'm going to make a more general approach to the question of the commons, because commons lies at the very center of some of our concerns around livestock. In fact, I won't be talking about the commons. I shall be talking around the commons. If you see the title of my presentation, it says Lobster Claws, use value, exchange value, and the keeping of the commons. Now, all of you have seen a lobster. You've seen its claws. There is one claw which is gigantic, and there is one claw which is atrophied. Now, I am seeing this whole question of how we relate to the commons in terms of this initial analogy, that our problem with the commons is that in our relationship with commons, one claw is extremely large and another claw is extremely atrophied. Let me explain what I mean, taking it forward. Again, beginning with an analogy from living creatures. As you know from ecology, all forms of life need to do 2 things. They need to maintain themselves and they need to reproduce themselves. It's called maintenance and reproduction. On the way a system or a form of life, a population or a community organizes its energy budget in terms of reproduction, in terms of maintenance, that defines the character of that particular population, the structure of that community. You have the well-known divisions of R species, K strategists, and so on. So you can have a population that is highly efficient, highly diversified, complex, which has got a strong component going of the energy budget going into maintenance. And you can have a system which is high levels of energy going into reproduction. You have high growth systems. They're volatile. They have different characteristics. Now, I want to take this idea forward and argue that when we look at the commons, we need to try and understand that this structure lies at the very core of how we approach the question of the commons. Now, human beings, of course, we don't reproduce biologically. Of course we do, but that's not the way we will conceptualize it. We live and we produce, it is through value. It is through value production that we, in fact, maintain and reproduce ourselves. Now, all human societies need to do both things. They need to maintain themselves. They also need to reproduce. Now, different parts of the labor process contribute to one, and one part contributes to another. I distinguish between these two, and I say one is use value and the other is exchange value. Use value contributes to the maintenance of populations, maintenance of systems. Exchange value contributes to reproduction, growth, development. These are the two dynamic systems that we are seeing. Now, the fact of the matter is that every human society needs to do this. However, there are huge variations in the way historical societies have done it. Today, we live in a society that claims, or rather represents itself as one that is dominated completely by exchange value production. There is no use value production. Everything is a commodity. All forms of labor are commoditized. But if we think about it, this is only an appearance. In an earlier session in the other hall, there was a discussion about the contributions of women's labor. The keynote speaker there had said that something like 40% of the GDP is, in terms of, if you can equate it to value, is contributed by women's labor. Now, I personally don't agree with that. I think it is impossible to quantify. There isn't enough money to actually measure the value of women's labor. Most of it is done in the use value domain. Now, the problem is that use value has no legitimacy in our political and economic imagination. It is something that we do not recognize. It is a child that is considered unfit for recognition. The fact, however, is that use value production lies interstitially enmeshed in many, many different domains of social reproduction. Women's labor is just one of them. Kinship systems provide the same thing. In some ways, family supporting systems provide the same thing. My argument is that common property resources, in fact, fall in that category of value production, which is dominated by use value, not exchange value production. Now, this is an important point because when Hardin threw that big stone 40 years ago, what did we do? My teacher, N.S. Jodha, what was his work about? It was trying to put a commodity value, a monetary value on the products of the commons. So one, in a sense, accepted that kind of language of commodification and sought legitimacy. I think the time now is to try and approach this question differently. So what I'm trying to get at and what I will try to build on is that exchange value, commodification, is like the media's touch. The moment it touches common property resources, it destroys it. It undermines it, it finishes it. So any kind of intervention that we have, any way of thinking which does not understand the fundamental character of this resource, this human-made resource, is in fact beginning on the wrong foot. Now, we are so completely enmeshed in a society dominated by exchange that we do not realize that all societies have not been like that. Very often, you will find in discussions in ecology and environment, people saying traditional institutions, traditional values, structures. But we do not have the economic language. In another session, I heard somebody talking about primitive systems. We do not have that language. The fact of the matter is that what they are referring to there is actually use value productions. And the institutions that we have today developed in societies, in political economies, where use value production had a legitimate space, a legitimate legal and economic space. Let me jump out of India and go to a place far away, medieval Europe, for example. You have something called serfdom. Now, that is a system of production in which labor has certain claims over resources, certain claims over land, which ensure its maintenance and its social reproduction. It is not as if there is no exchange value production. Both are there, but both seem to have a legitimate place in the system of production. Now, when we think of India also, this is precisely the kind of thing that we are thinking about. You are seeing societies, communities, cultures, values, which have integrated use value production into its economic life. Now, use value production can be very complex. The characteristic about use value production is that it is embodied. It cannot be the nature of alienation. For example, when I go and work for somebody, it is my labor time that is alienated. The product of labor is not alienated. Now, these conditions kind of shape the way commons have evolved. Now, I just have very little time, I know, but how do we realistically approach this question? Because we have not even learned how to think in these terms. See, we are today standing at a juncture where the euphoria of high modernism is past us. We are entered a period when we have to look at imaginations that are other than the high modernist imagination. 50 years ago, the situation was different. Our relationship with the past 50 years ago is very different from our relationship with the past today. 50 years ago, the relationship with feudalism was a fight against two contesting rationalities: the rationality of industrial modernity and the rationality of hierarchy and locality. Today, we are in a position where we can see the problems with the rationality of industrial modernity. But where do we try and find an alternate imagination? My feeling is that, yes, we recognize that it's been a hard-fought struggle and we cannot throw the baby with the bathwater, but we need to look at societies, cultures, and production systems where locality, where immanence, where embodiment played some kind of a role, both legitimate and in terms of actual realizing of the labor process itself. So I would say that when I talk about the lobster, the claw of the lobster, what is happening is that our economy, our political society, our developmental imagination is all tied up with that one lobster's claw which is on steroids, and the other lobster claw of use value which is severely atrophied. We need to recognize that steroids have to go from there, and this other form has to arrive at some form of growth and self-realization. It's not a question of either or. Every society needs both. Every system needs both. But this is the question that I would like to move. Now, I'll sum up by saying that all our imagination, whether it is liberal, market-oriented, whether it is communist, socialist, both are imaginations tied up with that lobster's claw on steroids. We are not at all open to alternative ways of imagining that society. There are traditions in India and elsewhere which think about the alternative way of imagining. Ecofeminism is one such approach which has tried to think in those terms. And you have a person in India by the name of Mohandas Karamchand. You can also look to Gandhi. Gandhi is a complex figure. Sometimes when you see him, you see cultural conservative. Then suddenly like that picture changes and you say, no, closet anarchist. What is it? We don't know. So I would say that my plea is that when we talk of common property resources, we need to look at the larger picture, and any attempts at trying to explain the value of this in terms of a commodity relationship basically destroys the rationale of the entire institution. Thank you.